The Legend of Zelda, and to a lesser extent Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, helped to popularize the non-linear adventure game. They weren't the first to try this sort of format. Adventure on the Atari 2600 could be looked at as a much earlier progenitor of the genre, but these were the games that made it popular. It's not hard to see why. They took place in a fantasy land. You played as a child with a sword, exploring unknown landscapes, solving cryptic puzzles, and defeating dangerous foes. Nowadays, the games might seem archaic to those who try to play them without prior knowledge of their mechanics, and I'll thoroughly admit they are the sorts of games that I personally have difficulty enjoying without some form of a guide beside me, but I can't deny that the two of them are still bursting with charm, and what they did for the medium overall can't be overstated. Naturally, much like how Super Mario Bros. Took the world by storm, there was a lot of interesting merchandise that was released for the Legend of Zelda series to coincide with the game's releases, and just because a lot of companies really liked money. Some of this was actually pretty cool and interesting, while a majority of it was just kitschy stuff. And one of the most well-remembered pieces of Zelda kitsch, for good or for ill, was the Legend of Zelda cartoon series. Now, if you aren't familiar with it, that's not really surprising, because despite it being one of the most well-remembered pieces of Zelda tat to come out of the Nintendo craze of the 80s, it wasn't really its own thing. You all remember the Super Mario Bros. Super Show? Well, while the live-action segments remained a consistent part of the show, they only showed the Mario cartoon segments Monday through Thursday. For a while, every Friday, the Mario cartoon segment was replaced with a Legend of Zelda cartoon. However, that only lasted for about 13 of the 65-episode run of the show, and once those 13 episodes were finished, they just reuse a previous episode for the Friday Zelda episode. Nowadays, neither show is packaged with one another for whatever reason. I mean, all 52 episodes of the Super Mario Bros. Super Show got their own releases in collection formats, but the Legend of Zelda cartoon was always released separately, usually in a much cheaper edition, and was never packaged with any of the material that could link it to the Super Show. Whereas this show actually did have the commercials for the Legend of Zelda, the Legend of Zelda was always its own thing, at least in the DVD collections. So, for all intents and purposes, the Zelda cartoon nowadays is treated as its own separate entity, which makes sense because it does feel like a very different cartoon compared to its brother show. When looking over the show, it is important to remember that there were only two games out. There was The Legend of Zelda, and there was Zelda 2. Neither of these games were particularly heavy on story or lore unless you read the manual, and even then, they only gave you the rough idea of everything in this world. Therefore, the creators of this cartoon had pretty free rein to try and flesh out the world however they wished. It's just a shame that they cocked it up so badly. I'll just be upfront here and say that I don't like this cartoon very much. Objectively, from a general structure standpoint, you could make the argument that the Super Mario Bros. Cartoon is worse, but I find that it had a weird sort of charm to it despite all its flaws. The Zelda cartoon, on the other hand, it lacks that charm, dragging down the IP that is the only thing that sets it apart from its contemporaries. All 13 episodes of the series are very episodic, but the overarching setup is what drives most of the plots. Link is now living in Hyrule Castle with Zelda, helping to defend the land from Ganon. Both are in a stalemate war with one another. Zelda has the Triforce of Wisdom, while Ganon has the Triforce of Power. Both are constantly trying to defeat one another and steal the opposing Triforce, as it is foretold that whoever can get both of them will be the ruler of Hyrule forever. Despite most plots revolving around this premise, neither side ever made any headway one way or the other. No matter how good the plan was or how inept the competition, the status quo was always reset at the end of the episode, and everything would be back to how it was beforehand. That was standard for most cartoons of the time, but when it came to shows like this that were allegedly working towards a logical conclusion, the defeat of Ganon and the uniting of the Triforces, it's quite annoying that it never reached that point, nor did it make any real progress towards that goal. This isn't helped by the fact that the world is populated by some of the worst characters you can imagine. Again, there wasn't much in the source material to go off of, but what little we were given didn't really match up with, well, this.
Is that what they call a royal flush?
Spare me the jokes. I think Ganon's up to something.
Yeah, you may be right.
Those are our heroes, folks. Look, even with what little we had to go off of, Link in the original games was still portrayed as being kind, altruistic, heroic, and the like. This version of Link, though, is more of a straight-up asshole.
Why? I'll pretend to be sick.
I'm not saying you can't make a hero who's snarky or has a few jerkish qualities, but here they overplayed their hand. This version of Link is lazy, whiny, rather ineffective, demanding, and more often than not has to be guilted, bribed, or tricked into being the hero he claims to be. If he actually grew or changed over the course of the series, I'd say this is a pretty okay starting point for a character. But the episodic nature of the series means that Link starts as an asshole, and he ends as an asshole. It's difficult to create a character that is unlikable and still have the audience root for them. They either need to change or get better as the series goes on, or they have to have enough redeeming qualities to counterbalance their jerkish nature. As I pointed out, Link doesn't have that, and half the time, it really seems like he would rather be doing anything else than being a hero. It's not even that he's a reluctant hero either, he just wants the perks without the work. As if to make this even more obvious, Link is the butt of many of the series' jokes, which only highlights just how inept of a character he is. Zelda kinda gets out of this new characterization a bit better. She's portrayed as a real leader, someone who takes her duties quite seriously, no matter how tedious or annoying the job might be, which explains why she puts up with Link as much as she does. She's still not that good of a character though. Despite being shown to be a very take-charge sort of personality, she's also portrayed as the chick. While she spends about as much time saving Link as Link spends saving her, more often than not she ends up kidnapped or made just as ineffectual despite being a rather capable fighter. That's to say nothing of the fact that she more often than not has to resort to bribery to get Link to do anything for her, usually with a kiss, which Link never gets. Seriously, that's the main running gag of the entire show, Link trying his best to get Zelda to give him a kiss, but it never happens. Either she actively avoids it, or when she does actually promise him one, she reneges on it not long afterwards. Well, that and the infamous,
Hey! Excuse me, princess!
Even if you haven't seen the cartoon, you've probably heard that used at some point or another, because the internet just loves to make jokes using that line, and it shows up as often as the kissing joke. Ganon, our main villain, probably suffers the most out of the three of them. Ganon, the king of evil, the ultimate villain of Zelda's story, is reduced to a warlock version of Cobra Commander.
Obviously. If I want the Triforce of Wisdom, I'm going to have to get it myself!
His schemes are harebrained, his persona is loathsome, and everything he does is played for comedy. By default, this actually makes him the best character in the series, or at the very least the most entertaining. He is, by and large, treated as any other 80s kid show villain would be. Megatron, Cobra Commander, Skeletor, Tex Hex, that one guy who was in that one episode of My Little Pony that one time. He fits in well with that entire group. But again, that automatically makes him the best of the main characters just because he's actually entertaining. It's a very bad sign when I'm rooting for your ineffectual villain compared to the characters who are supposed to be our main heroes. As mentioned above, almost every plot revolves around Ganon attempting to kidnap Zelda, kill Link, get the Triforce of Wisdom, or do all three at once. And every single one of them utilizes a cliche from the big book of 80s kids shows. You got a doppelganger episode, you got a contest episode, you got the full-scale attack episode, you got the romantic rival episode on both sides of the gender fence, and they all go exactly as you would expect. There is not a single surprise in this entire show, and once again, it is leaning entirely on the popularity of its IP in order to sell itself. Believe it or not, I do have some positives to talk about in this show. The actual design of the world of Hyrule is very nicely done. The backgrounds and environments are lush and beautifully detailed. For Deke at the time, this is great. And the character designs are pretty good too. Not Zelda or Link, I'm not terribly fond of the styles that they went with those two. but the creatures they encounter and the monsters that Ganon commands, there was a surprising amount of effort put into making them resemble their game counterparts, and all the classics are here. Moblins, Stalfos, Tektites, Octoroks, Keys, they're all here and pretty brilliantly designed. Kudos on that front. The actual animation itself is shaky more often than not, but it does manage to hold up a little better than DiC's other shows at the time. Except when they're underwater and the bubbles don't even move. Anyway, along with that, I can also praise the sound direction as well, believe it or not. The music is pretty well done, especially the tunes that sample the original Zelda themes. The rest of the music isn't really memorable, but it serves the scene and the setting well for what it is. I don't really have a complaint about it. This continues into the sound effects and the Foley. They all sound really nice and peppy, and the integration of sound effects from the game is very nicely done. Some of them can sound kind of out of place, but I do appreciate the authenticity. It's pretty annoying though. The creators obviously went out of their way to throw in as many references, sounds, and enemies from the first two games as they could, but when it came time to craft an actual story and characters for that story, they dropped the ball so hard. Speaking of the characters, the one thing I'll praise about them is their voices. The voice acting in this show is actually really well done. I have no complaints about it, well, except for Ganon. He just sounds way too goofy to be taken seriously, which I think was the intention. But everyone else, the voice fits their design and the personality. No one really turns in a poor performance here, but this is a prime example of having good voice actors and good direction, but neither being able to save what is ultimately really poorly written material. And that to me is the ultimate tragedy of this cartoon. I do think that there was a lot of potential here, but like any adaptation job, it has to be given to people who genuinely care about the source material and want to create something that is memorable and unique and still remains true to its original IP. And I guess at this point I can't really blame Nintendo for being protective of their properties. Hell, they didn't even want to let DiC make any of the cartoons based around their properties, but I guess they were browbeaten into it or something. If you're at all curious, the entire series is really easy to find. Physical releases for all 13 episodes can be found all over the place by several different companies, but all of them are dirt cheap. Or if you don't want a physical copy, all 13 episodes have flooded places like YouTube and Dailymotion for years. It's not tough to find it if you want to indulge your morbid curiosity. It's far from the only terrible adaptation of a beloved IP. Hell, it's not even the worst as far as I'm concerned. But the main reason that people remember it is because it has that link to a beloved IP. It is a cartoon based on The Legend of Zelda. And for good or for ill, that has basically cemented its sordid place in history. But maybe in a way that is a good thing, because after all, as human beings, the only way that we can learn from and overcome our mistakes is to remember them. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you all next time.